My brother fired me in the very office I had built, but he had no idea that I had purchased the entire dock his shipping empire depended on. I walked out of the boardroom looking like a loser. But as it turned out, I was the one controlling this game all along. He thought I was just the shadow behind the company's success. He didn't know that Shadow held the vital keys. The morning began like any other at Silverline Freight. I arrived at 5:30 a.m., just as the first light broke over Bayford Harbor. Oregon mornings in September had a certain crisp quality, the salt air mingling with the scent of pine from the surrounding forests. I'd been making this same drive for 18 years, watching as our family company grew from 3 vessels to a fleet of 27 ships and over 400 employees. My office overlooked the main loading dock, and I could see Docks 7 and 8 from my window, the heart of our operation. Through that window, I'd watch storms, celebrations, accidents, and miracles. I'd built most of this place with careful planning and relentless attention to detail. The shipping routes, the logistics systems, the employee schedules, they all bore my fingerprints. My phone buzzed. A text from Blake. Emergency board meeting, 9 a.m., my office. I frowned. Blake Whitmore, my half-brother, 10 years my junior, and the recently appointed CEO hadn't mentioned any meeting when we'd spoken yesterday. A familiar unease settled in my stomach. Since our father had stepped back 6 months ago, these emergency meetings had become increasingly common. Each one seemed to erase another piece of what I'd built. When I arrived at Blake's office, formerly our father's, and before that, our grandfather's, Blake was already seated at the head of the table. Jason Rowe sat to his right, smirking slightly. 3 board members I barely recognized filled the other seats. "Lauren, thanks for joining us," Blake said, not looking up from his tablet. At 43, I was still treated like an intern by my 33-year-old brother. "We're making some changes to the executive structure." I nodded, taking my usual seat. Something felt off. The leather portfolio I always brought to meetings felt suddenly heavy in my hands. "The board and I have been discussing the future direction of Silverline Freight," Blake continued, finally looking up. His blue eyes, so like our father's, held none of the warmth Dad's had. "We need modern management, fresh thinking, a more agile approach to logistics." The words hung in the air for a moment before I realized what was happening. "You're firing me," I said, not a question. Blake had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "We're restructuring. The COO position is being reimagined, and we're bringing in someone with a different perspective." Jason Rowe's smirk widened into a smile. Of course. The consultant who'd been whispering in Blake's ear for months, the one whose previous 3 shipping logistics ventures had all failed spectacularly, would be taking my place. "I see," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "And when does this restructuring take effect?" "Immediately," Blake replied. "HR has prepared your separation package. The terms are generous." Generous. As if that mattered. As if 18 years of my life could be compensated with a severance check. I didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't remind them that our quarterly shipping volume had doubled under my management, or that our safety record was the best in the Pacific Northwest. None of that would matter now. Blake had made up his mind, and these new board members' friends from his MBA program no doubt would back him. Instead, I stood, collected the single-framed photograph from my desk, my mother and grandfather standing on the original dock nearly 40 years ago, and walked to the door. "You should check the lease rights on Docks 7 and 8, I said quietly, my hand on the doorknob. Blake frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" I just smiled. "Good luck with your fresh thinking." The door closed behind me with a soft click. The drive home was surreal. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, I was heading away from the docks at 9:30 in the morning. My house sat on a small bluff overlooking the bay. About 15 minutes from the Silverline headquarters, I could see their ships from my back deck on clear days. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat on that deck now, watching a container vessel slowly making its way toward Dock 8. The September sun had burned off the morning fog, and the water sparkled. It was beautiful. How long had it been since I'd seen this view in daylight on a weekday? My phone rang. "Dad." "I just heard," he said when I answered. Blake didn't even consult me. Robert Whitmore had built Silverline from nothing. Expanding from a single tugboat, to the shipping empire it was today. At 72, he decided to step back, handing control to Blake rather than me. Blake has the modern education, he'd explained at the time. He'll take Silverline into the future. He'd never said the rest aloud that he believed a son would carry on the family name better than a daughter. "It's done," I said, sipping my coffee. "Nothing to be done about it now." "I could talk to him," Dad offered, but his voice lacked conviction. Since his second marriage to Blake's mother 20 years earlier, he'd always deferred to his son. It had been the same story my entire life. Blake got the attention, the praise, the opportunities. I got the work. "Don't bother," I replied. "But you might want to ask him about the dock leases." A pause. "What about them?" I smiled, though he couldn't see it. 5 years ago, when you put me in charge of expansion, I realized something. Silverline doesn't own Docks 7 and 8. We lease them from the Bayford Port Authority. Of course, that's been the arrangement since my father's time. The original 99-year lease expired in 2019. You were busy with Diane's health issues then, so you told me to handle the renewal. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Lauren, what did you do?" "I formed an LLC called Whitmore Heritage Properties. I bought the leasing rights from the Port Authority. Silverline has been leasing those docks from my company for the past 5 years. Another long silence. "Does Blake know this?" "He's about to find out. The current lease agreement expires in 30 days. I was going to renew it at the same favorable rate as before. But now, I think market value is more appropriate." I could hear my father's breathing on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight. "This feels like revenge, Lauren." "No, Dad, it's business. Blake wants modern management. He's about to get a modern lesson in due diligence." I ended the call and turned my phone off. For the first time in years, I had nothing to do, nowhere to be. I watched the container ship dock, cranes swinging into position to unload. From this distance, it looked like a choreographed dance one I'd helped orchestrate for years. Tomorrow, I would call my lawyer and begin preparing the new lease terms. Today, I would just watch the water and breathe. 3 days passed before the first text messages started coming in from my former colleagues. Most were sympathetic, expressing shock at my dismissal, but a few contained worrying information. "Jason's cutting corners on the loading schedules. 2 near misses already this week. They're pushing for 24-hour turnarounds now. Safety protocols getting ignored. Blake announced a new efficiency plan. Less crew, more cargo." I'd spent years building Silverline's safety record, ensuring that both our workers and cargo arrived intact, in just days. Blake and Jason were dismantling those systems in the name of profit and modern management. I felt a twinge of guilt. Was I putting those workers at risk by planning to leverage my ownership of the docks? Would Blake just pass on the increased costs to the employees through cuts and speed-ups? My phone rang, interrupting these thoughts. An unfamiliar number. "Ms. Whitmore, this is Margaret Chen from Pacific Maritime Insurance. I'm calling regarding the property ownership verification for Silverline Freight's policy." I sat up straighter. "What can I help you with?" "We're conducting our annual review and noticed some discrepancies in the documentation for Docks 7 and 8 at Bayford Harbor. Our records show these properties are leased by Silverline Freight from Whitmore Heritage Properties, but the insurance policy lists them as Silverline-owned assets." Of course they did. Blake wouldn't have bothered to check the fine print of the company's insurance policies. "That's incorrect," I confirmed. "Whitmore Heritage Properties is the legal owner of the leasing rights for both docks. Silverline is the lessee." "I see," she replied, and I could hear her typing. "And are you authorized to speak on behalf of Whitmore Heritage Properties?" "I am the sole owner and managing director." More typing. "Ms. Whitmore, I should inform you that this creates a significant issue with Silverline's current policy. They've insured property they don't actually own, which could invalidate certain coverage aspects." "That sounds like a problem for Silverline's management to address," I said calmly. "I'd be happy to provide documentation confirming Whitmore Heritage's ownership." After the call, I sat back in my chair, thinking. Insurance complications were just the beginning. Once Blake realized the docks were actually mine, he'd scramble to find alternatives and find none. Bayford Harbor had no other deep-water docks available. The nearest suitable port was over 60 miles up the coast. I should have felt satisfied, but instead, I felt hollow. This wasn't just about Blake anymore. People's livelihoods were at stake, the same people who had worked alongside me for years. That evening, I made another call to Martin Reynolds, a private investigator I'd used occasionally for background checks on potential business partners. I need information on any new business ventures my brother might be involved with, I explained, particularly anything related to shipping or port facilities. The usual discretion, I assume, Martin asked. Absolutely, and I need it quickly. 2 days later, Martin delivered his findings. Blake had been busy indeed. He'd formed a new company called Clearwave Logistics 6 months ago, right around the time our father had stepped back from Silverline. Clearwave had applied for permits to develop a new shipping facility 10 miles up the coast, using a previously abandoned industrial site. More concerning was the pitch deck Martin had somehow obtained a presentation Blake had been showing to potential investors. It outlined a revolutionary new logistics model that was, in fact, the exact system I had developed and implemented at Silverline over the past decade. My scheduling algorithms, my container tracking system, my staffing model, all presented as Blake's innovations. I called my lawyer immediately. Carolyn, I need to know if I have any intellectual property claims here. These systems were developed while I was an employee of Silverline. Carolyn Harrison had been my personal attorney for years. She understood the family dynamics at play. Did you ever document these systems outside of your work at Silverline personal notes, development records, earlier versions? I thought about the extensive documentation I'd kept at home, iterations of the systems, notes from middle-of-the-night inspirations, spreadsheets tracking improvements. Yes, extensive records, dating back years before the final implementations. Good. And were you ever asked to sign any IP agreements stating that work done during your employment belonged exclusively to the company? No, our contracts were surprisingly basic. Dad never thought such formalities were necessary between family. Then we have a strong case that these are your personal intellectual creations that you implemented at Silverline, rather than works created specifically for hire. I spent the next week gathering documentation, every notebook, every digital file, every email that showed the evolution of my logistics systems. I had Carolyn prepare cease and desist letters, but I didn't send them yet. I was developing a more comprehensive plan. My next call was to Michael Patel, CEO of Ridgeport Marine, one of Silverline's competitors, though a smaller operation focused on specialized shipping rather than container volume. Lauren Whitmore, Michael said when he answered. This is unexpected. I heard about your departure from Silverline. News travels fast, I replied. I'm calling with a business proposition. I'm listening. I own the leasing rights to Docks 7 and 8 at Bayford Harbor. I'm looking for a new tenant, and I thought Ridgeport might be interested in expanding its operations. There was a pause. Those are prime deep-water docks, but surely Silverline. Their current lease expires in 3 weeks. I'm not renewing with them. Another pause. This sounds personal. Lauren? It's business. Michael, Silverline is cutting corners on safety to increase profits. That's not how I do business, and I don't want it happening on my property. And what exactly are you proposing? I want Ridgeport to take over operation of the docks. You'd lease them from me at fair market value, which is considerably higher than what Silverline has been paying, but still competitive. You'd gain immediate access to deep-water facilities that would otherwise take years to develop. And what would stop me from pushing out Silverline entirely that would effectively kill your family's company? I'd considered this. The lease would include provisions allowing certain Silverline vessels continued access at reasonable rates. I'm not looking to destroy the company just to ensure it's run properly. Michael was silent for a long moment. Send me the details. I'll need to discuss this with my board. Over the next week, I had discreet conversations with key personnel from Silverline, people I'd worked with for years and trusted implicitly. Marco Diaz, the dock foreman, Sarah Klein, head of engineering, Luis Rodriguez, shift supervisor, Wei Chen, our brilliant logistics programmer. I didn't explicitly offer them jobs, but I made sure they knew about Ridgeport's likely expansion. One by one, they began submitting their resignations to Silverline. Blake called me in a rage after the 5th resignation. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded. "You're poaching our staff." I'm not doing anything, I replied calmly. People make their own career decisions. You think I don't know what's happening? You're trying to sabotage me because you're bitter about being let go. Blake, I haven't offered anyone a job. I haven't even spoken to Silverline officially since I left. If people are leaving, perhaps you should ask yourself why. This isn't over, he snapped before hanging up. He was right about that. At least, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. 2 days before the lease expiration, I received a call from Michael Patel. We're in, he said simply. My board approved the dock lease and the expansion plan. We're prepared to hire most of the key personnel who've left Silverline, and we can accommodate the access provisions for their vessels. Excellent, I replied. Carolyn will send over the final contracts today. There's something else, Michael added. We've been approached by several of Silverline's clients who are concerned about service disruptions. They've heard rumors about staffing issues and safety concerns. And they're looking for alternatives. If we can guarantee the same level of service with better safety protocols, they're prepared to switch to Ridgeport immediately. I hadn't anticipated this, but it made sense. The shipping industry was small, and word traveled fast. Clients would naturally protect their interests if they sensed trouble at Silverline. That's between you and them, I said carefully. My concern is ensuring the docks are operated safely and efficiently. The day the lease expired, Blake called an emergency board meeting at Silverline. Through my contacts, I learned the company was facing a financial crisis, with key personnel gone, clients defecting, and now the imminent loss of their primary docking facilities. Silverline was in freefall. I wasn't invited to the meeting, of course, but I arrived anyway. The receptionist knew. Someone I didn't recognize tried to stop me, but I walked past her into the boardroom. Blake was mid-sentence when I entered. He stopped, his face flushing with anger. This is a private meeting. You need to leave. I looked around the table. The board members seemed tense. Dad sat at the far end, looking older than I'd ever seen him. I think you'll want to hear what I have to say, I replied, setting a folder on the table, especially since you're discussing the dock situation. One of the board members, a woman I vaguely recognized from Blake's business school cohort, spoke up. Ms. Whitmore, this is highly irregular. What's irregular? I interrupted. Is that your CEO has been planning to abandon Silverline while stealing its intellectual property. The room went silent. Blake's face drained of color. That's absurd, he sputtered. I opened the folder and pulled out copies of the Clearwave logistics documents Martin had obtained. These permit applications were filed 6 months ago, right when Dad stepped back, and this pitch deck, I slid out the glossy presentation, contains logistics systems that I developed and own the intellectual rights to. The board members leaned forward, examining the documents. Blake stood up. This is a desperate attempt to what? I cut in. To show that while you were firing me for allegedly outdated thinking, you were planning to use my exact systems for your new venture, to reveal that you've been actively undermining the company our grandfather started. Dad picked up the permit application, his hand trembling slightly as he read. Is this true, Blake? He asked quietly. Blake looked trapped. It was a contingency plan, a backup option in case what? I pressed. In case you ran Silverline into the ground with your reckless decisions. In case the experienced staff all left because you prioritized speed over safety. Or in case someone discovered that you've been diverting potential Silverline clients to your new venture. That last part was a guess, but from Blake's expression, I knew I'd hit the mark. The board erupted in questions, accusations, and demands for explanation. Through the chaos, I made my way around the table to where Dad sat, still staring at the documents. I'm sorry, I said softly. I didn't want it to come to this. He looked up at me, eyes clouded with disappointment, though whether directed at Blake or me, I couldn't tell. What happens now? He asked. That depends on the board. I replied. But I have a proposal that might save what's left of Silverline. I laid out the plan I developed with Michael Patel. Ridgeport would take over operation of the docks and hire many of Silverline's former staff. Silverline would maintain access to the facilities through a structured agreement. Most importantly, I would serve as Chief Operations Officer for the new combined port operations, NIA as CEO, but in the role where I could ensure things ran properly. This is a hostile takeover, Blake said bitterly when I finished. No, I corrected him. It's a rescue operation, and it's your only viable option at this point. The board took less than an hour to reach their decision. Blake was removed as CEO, pending a full investigation of his activities with Clearwave Logistics. The agreement with Ridgeport was provisionally approved, subject to final contract review. As the meeting adjourned, Blake stormed out without speaking to anyone. Most of the board members followed, leaving just Dad and me in the room. "You could have told me what you were planning," he said after a long silence. "Would you have believed me? Or would you have defended Blake, like you always have?" He winced. "I've not always been fair to you, have I?" "No," I agreed. "But this wasn't about settling old scores. Dad, it was about protecting what you and Grandpa built. Blake would have gutted it for quick profits and moved on." He nodded slowly. "You're more like your mother than I sometimes remember. She always took the long view, too." Coming from him, it was high praise. My mother had been brilliant, a marine engineer who died when I was just 12. Her absence had left a hole in both our lives, one that Blake and his mother had never quite filled. "What will you do now?" I asked. He sighed. "Retire properly this time. Let the next generation take over." He gave me a small smile. The right next generation. 1 year later, I stood on Dock 8 watching the morning fog roll in from the Pacific. The Bayford Harbor operations were running more smoothly than ever. The merger of Ridgeport's specialized services with Silverline's container business, now under new management, had created a more resilient operation than either company had been separately. Blake had left the industry entirely. Last I heard, he was consulting for startups in Seattle. Though his reputation had followed him, the investigation into Clearwave Logistics had revealed even more ethical breaches than I'd initially discovered. I didn't have a grand title anymore. My business card simply read, Director of Port Operations. But everyone from the dock workers to the ship captains knew that nothing moved through Bayford Harbor without my approval. Dad came to visit occasionally, proudly watching the operation from my office window. He'd apologized, in his way, for the years of favoritism. We were working on rebuilding our relationship slowly, like the careful restoration of an old ship. "Ms. Whitmore," Marco's voice broke into my thoughts. "The meridian is approaching, right on schedule." I nodded, checking my watch. 5:58 a.m., 2 minutes early. "Actually, let's bring her in," I said. As I watched the massive container ship approach, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. The smooth, safe operation of the docks, the livelihood supported, the goods flowing efficiently to their destinations was what mattered. Not titles or corner offices or family legacy, but the actual work. I'd built this system from the ground up, and now I was ensuring it would outlast any single person's ambition. That was the real victory, one that would endure long after the story of Blake's betrayal had faded from memory. Behind me, the port was coming alive with the day shift. Cranes swung into position. Workers called to each other. Trucks lined up to receive their cargo. The system I'd designed, my true legacy, continued to function like a living organism, adapting and growing stronger with each passing day. I smiled as the first rays of sunlight broke through the fog, illuminating the water. This was never about ownership or control. It was about building something that worked, something that lasted. Something worthy of the photograph that still sat on my desk, my mother and grandfather standing proudly on the original dock. Their eyes fixed not on what was, but on what could be. Blake had fired me, thinking he was cutting me loose from the company I'd helped build. He hadn't realized that I wasn't just a shadow behind Silverline's success, I was its foundation. And foundations, when properly laid, endure long after the structures above them have changed. The Meridian's horn sounded as it approached the dock. Another day, another ship, another opportunity to prove that doing things right matters more than doing them fast or flashy. That, in the end, was the most important lesson of all. My name is Lauren Whitmore, and I don't own a shipping empire. I own something far more valuable, the knowledge of how to make it work. The weeks after Blake's dismissal were chaotic but productive. The board of Silverline appointed an interim CEO, Janet Kerrigan, a veteran of the shipping industry who had retired 2 years earlier. Her first call had been to me. "I'm not coming back as your subordinate," I'd told her bluntly. "I wouldn't expect you to," she replied. I'm a temporary solution. My job is to stabilize the company and prepare for whatever comes next. I need your expertise, but I don't need you under my authority. We'd worked out an arrangement where I served as a consultant to Silverline while maintaining my position with the Ridgeport-Bayford port operations. It was an unusual setup, but it worked. Janet focused on repairing client relationships and financial structures, while I ensured the operational side ran smoothly. The integration of the two companies' systems wasn't without challenges. Ridgeport's specialized shipping required different handling procedures than Silverline's container business. Training staff to handle both was an ongoing process. We need more cross-training, I told Michael during one of our weekly meetings. The specialized cargo handlers need to understand the container systems, and vice versa. He nodded. I agree, but it's going to take time. We're already pushing people hard with the increased volume. This was true. With word spreading about our improved safety record and reliable scheduling, new clients were approaching us daily. The challenge wasn't finding business, but managing growth. We need to hire, I said, and not just entry-level positions. We need experienced supervisors who can train others. Budget's tight after the merger costs, Michael reminded me. Then we prioritize. Safety-critical positions first, then key operational roles. We can delay some of the administrative hires. Michael smiled. This is why I wanted you running operations. You always see the whole picture. The whole picture included more than just Ridgeport and Silverline. It encompassed the entire community around Bayford Harbor. The shipping industry was the lifeblood of the town, providing not just direct jobs, but supporting countless other businesses from the cafe where workers grabbed breakfast to the schools their children attended. I established a community advisory board, bringing together representatives from local businesses, environmental groups, and civic organizations. Their input helped us make decisions that benefited not just our bottom line, but the region as a whole. We're not just moving cargo, I explained at our first meeting. We're supporting a community. If we succeed while Bayford struggles, that's not real success. Not everyone understood this perspective. Some investors questioned the resources devoted to community engagement and environmental protections that exceeded regulatory requirements. Those aren't expenses, I argued during a particularly tense board meeting. They're investments in long-term sustainability. A port operation can't thrive if the surrounding community resents its presence, or if environmental damage creates regulatory backlash. Dad attended that meeting as an observer. Afterward, he pulled me aside. You reminded me of your grandfather today, he said. He always said a business had to serve more than its shareholders to truly succeed. I thought you considered that view outdated, I replied, remembering his frequent comments about modern business realities when he'd handed control to Blake. He looked away, his gaze falling on the harbor visible through the conference room windows. I lost sight of some important truths in recent years. Your mother would have been disappointed in me for that. She always said the only truly sustainable business was one that lifted everyone around it. Coming from him, this was as close to an apology as I was likely to get. I accepted it with a nod. We're trying to build something that will last, I said. That means thinking beyond quarterly profits. 6 months into the new arrangement, we faced our first major crisis. A storm more severe than any in recent memory battered the Oregon coast. Dock 7 sustained significant damage, and emergency repairs would take weeks. We need to prioritize which shipments move through Dock 8 and which get delayed. I told the emergency response team I'd assembled. Essential supplies first: medical equipment, food, emergency response materials. Commercial goods can wait. The logistics were complicated. Some ships were already en route and couldn't easily be diverted. Others could be rescheduled, but at considerable expense. Every decision involved trade-offs. I worked around the clock for 3 days straight, sleeping on the cot I kept in my office. By the 4th day, we had a functioning system in place. Dock 8 was operating at 150% of its normal capacity, with crews working in carefully managed shifts to avoid fatigue-related accidents. On the 5th day, Blake showed up at my office. I heard about the storm damage, he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. He looked different, thinner, less polished. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by casual business attire. What do you want? Blake, I asked. not bothering to mask my exhaustion or irritation. I've been consulting on supply chain resilience for a tech company in Seattle. When I heard about what happened here, I thought maybe I could help. I stared at him, trying to discern his real motivation. Why would you want to help? He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so like our father's that it was momentarily disorienting. Because I screwed up, Lauren, massively. I let ambition and ego cloud my judgment, and I hurt a lot of people in the process, including you. He paused. Especially you. I'd imagined this moment many times over the past months, Blake acknowledging his mistakes, apologizing, in my imagination. I'd felt vindicated, triumphant. The reality was more complicated. He looked genuinely remorseful, but also broken in a way I hadn't anticipated. What exactly are you offering? I asked. I have contacts at shipping companies up and down the coast. I could help coordinate alternative arrangements for non-essential cargo until Dock 7 is repaired. No charge, no credit, just helping. I considered this. We could use the assistance, and his contacts might indeed be valuable, but trust, once broken, wasn't easily repaired. You'd be working under Marco's direction, I said finally. He's coordinating all rerouting, and at the first sign of any self-serving behavior, you're out. Relief washed over his face. That's fair. More than fair. For the next 2 weeks, Blake worked tirelessly alongside the rest of the team. He kept his head down, followed instructions, and leveraged his contacts effectively. Several shipments that would have been severely delayed were accommodated at other ports with minimal disruption. On his last day, as Dock 7 repairs neared completion, he stopped by my office again. Thank you, he said simply, for letting me help. I nodded. You did good work. I'm moving to Portland next month, he continued, taking a position with a logistics technology firm, not competing with you, he added quickly. They develop tracking software for the industry. Sounds like a good fit, I replied neutrally. He hesitated, then said, I know a simple apology doesn't fix what I did, but I am sorry. Lauren, I was jealous of your relationship with Dad, of how everyone respected you. I wanted to prove I could do better, be more innovative. Instead, I nearly destroyed everything. The admission surprised me. Blake had never acknowledged jealousy before, always projecting confidence and entitlement. We all make mistakes, I said finally. The question is whether we learn from them. He nodded. I'm trying to. He turned to leave, then paused. Dad's proud of what you've built here. You know, he talks about it all the time. After he left, I sat thinking about forgiveness and second chances. I wasn't ready to fully trust Blake again, but perhaps in time, some form of relationship could be rebuilt not as executives competing for control, but as siblings with separate paths. The following month brought new challenges and opportunities. A major shipping company on the East Coast approached us about establishing a strategic partnership that would create a coast-to-coast integrated service. This could transform both our operations, Michael said as we reviewed the proposal. But it would mean significant changes to our current structure. I studied the details. The potential is enormous, but so are the risks. We'd need to be certain our cultures align before committing. We arranged a series of meetings with their executive team, flying to Boston to tour their facilities and host them at ours. The more we learned, the more promising the partnership appeared. They've built something remarkably similar to what we have, I told Michael after one particularly productive session. Different coast, different specific challenges, but the same philosophy about balancing efficiency with safety and community impact. The partnership agreement took 3 months to finalize. When the documents were finally signed, we held a celebration at the Harborside Park we'd helped fund as part of our community engagement initiative. Employees from both companies, local officials, and community members gathered for a day of food, music, and optimism about the future. Dad attended, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. He'd started dating again a widow who taught marine biology at the community college and had become involved in a conservation program for coastal habitats. You've exceeded all my expectations, he told me as we watched children playing on the new playground equipment. Not just with the business, but with how you've handled everything. I had good teachers, I replied. You and Mom both taught me to think beyond myself. He smiled sadly. She would have been so proud of you. She always saw your potential, even when you were little. That girl will build something remarkable someday, she used to say. We stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the celebration unfold around us. The partnership would create new opportunities for everyone involved, more stable employment, broader career paths, stronger community support. Later that evening, as the event wound down, I walked out onto Dock 8. The lights from the harbor reflected on the water, and the sound of gentle waves against the pilings created a soothing rhythm. This place had been the center of my professional life for nearly 2 decades. I'd fought for it, protected it, and ultimately transformed it into something better than it had been before. Not through hostile tactics or revenge, but through vision and persistence. I thought about the path that had led here, from the little girl watching her mother and grandfather work on ships, to the executive who'd been underestimated and dismissed, to the architect of a new kind of port operation that prioritized people alongside profits. The firing that had seemed so devastating had actually been the catalyst for something far more significant. Without that moment, I might have continued working within constraints I hadn't even recognized, trying to prove myself within a system that wasn't designed to value my contributions. Sometimes, I realized, what looks like an ending is actually the beginning of something far more meaningful. The key is recognizing the opportunity hidden within the crisis. A ship's horn sounded in the distance, one of ours, returning from a Pacific crossing, right on schedule. As usual. The system worked. The people thrived. The community benefited. That was the true victory, not owning docks or controlling companies, but creating something that served a purpose larger than any individual's ambition. Something that would endure. I smiled as the lights of the approaching vessel grew brighter. Another day, another ship, another reminder that doing things right matters more than doing them for the right to claim credit. That was a lesson worth learning, even if it had come through difficult circumstances, and it was a legacy worth building. One careful decision at a time. My name is Lauren Whitmore, and I don't need to own an empire. I'd rather build a community. 2 years after Blake's dismissal, Ridgeport Silver Line Integrated Shipping had become the model other port operations sought to emulate. Our safety record, community engagement, and financial stability had earned industry recognition and attracted business from companies committed to responsible supply chain management. I still kept the same schedule, arriving at the docks before sunrise to watch the day's operations begin. Some habits were too deeply ingrained to break, and this quiet time helped me maintain perspective on what we were building. On this particular morning, as I sipped coffee from my thermos, Luis approached with a concerned expression. "We've got a situation with the Majestic Star," he said, referring to one of our larger container vessels. "Mechanical issue reported about 2 hours out. They can maintain headway, but they're requesting priority docking and immediate maintenance support." I nodded. "Alert the emergency response team and clear Dock 8. Have the maintenance crew ready with the parts most likely needed based on the reported symptoms." Luis hurried off to coordinate the response. This was exactly the kind of situation our integrated systems were designed to handle: unexpected problems that required rapid, coordinated action across multiple departments. By the time the Majestic Star appeared on the horizon, everything was in place, the dock was clear, the maintenance team assembled, and alternative arrangements made for the vessel that had been scheduled to use Dock 8 that morning. I watched from the control room as the ship was guided into position. Despite the mechanical issue, the docking proceeded smoothly, a testament to the crew's training and our well-established procedures. "Nicely done," said a voice behind me. I turned to see Janet Kerrigan, who had stayed on as a senior advisor after her interim CEO role ended. "The systems worked as designed," I replied. "Systems don't design themselves," she pointed out, "nor do they adapt to changing circumstances without the right leadership." Janet had become something of a mentor to me over the past 2 years. Her decades of industry experience provided valuable perspective, and her straightforward communication style matched my own. "Have you given any more thought to the board's proposal?" she asked, as we watched the maintenance team board the Majestic Star. The proposal in question was for me to take on the CEO role for the entire integrated operation. Michael was retiring next year and had recommended me as his successor. "I'm still considering it," I said. "I'm not convinced it's the right move." Janet raised an eyebrow. Most people would jump at the opportunity. I'm not most people. I turned back to the window. I'm effective in operations. I understand the practical realities of shipping logistics in a way that many executives don't. Moving to the CEO role would mean less direct involvement in what we actually do here. It would also mean more influence over the strategic direction of the company, Janet countered. The ability to ensure your values remain central to the operation long term. She had a point. As operations director, I could maintain our standards for now. As CEO, I could build those standards into the company's DNA in ways that would outlast my tenure. I'll decide by the end of the month, I promised. The Majestic Star situation was resolved by mid-afternoon. The maintenance team identified and repaired the issue of fuel pump malfunction, and the ship was cleared to continue its journey after a 6-hour delay, far better than the potential 2